Hi there, esteemed audience, and welcome to another episode of Middle Grade Ninja. As you know, I'm your host, Rob Kent. I'm the author of Banneker Bones and the Cyborg Conspiracy, which will be available May 15th of this year. Depending on when you're listening to it, it may be available right now. Certainly, it's available to pre order. Go ahead. I promise that it is worth the money. It's a wonderful conclusion to a trilogy of middle grade books that are the most important thing I've ever written. If you haven't started or haven't got caught up with Banneker Bones to this point, no fear. Nice thing about books is they're around for whenever you need them. In Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees, the first book in the story of 11-year-old detectives that fly around on jetpacks and do battle with robots and monsters and all kinds of wonderful stuff. Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees is available as a paperback, an audiobook, narrated by the exquisite David Radke, and you're listening to this, so I assume you like listening to things. Or the ebook is free to download whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. Check that out. Once you're hooked on the series, come see me with money for Banneker Bones and the Alligator People, and then again in May for Banneker Bones and the Cyborg Conspiracy. Under the super secret pen name Robert Kent, I've written some horror stories for older readers. The young adult novel All Together Now, a Zombie Story. I'd tell you about them, but I already took up too much time telling you about Banneker. Check out Chapter 1 of the Book of David by Robert Kent. That one is also an ebook that's free to download. And if you like that, there's 4 more books where that came from. Long horror story in the style of Stephen King about an atheist that buys a haunted house that then begins to give him religious visions involving flying saucers. It's a good time. I promise you're going to have fun. As always, for more information about what's going on with the show, what's going on with me, keep tabs at middlegradeninja.com. You can read hundreds of interviews there with literary agents, editors, authors, folks you would be interested in, as well as get a schedule of who's going to be appearing on the show, upcoming episode dates. Other than that, tune in every Saturday. Make sure you like, subscribe, all that great stuff. Enough. Let's get to it. I couldn't be more thrilled today. We're going to welcome Anne Bustard, who is the author of this new novel, Blue Skies, and many others. Anne, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Probably the best place for us to get started is I could try to summarize your biography and just make a mess of it. By the time I got to the end of it, you'd just be glaring at me. That's not who I am at all. So if you would, give esteemed audience kind of an overview of your background.
Okay. So I was born in Hawaii, and my mother named me Anne after Anne of Green Gables. And last year, I became a permanent resident of Canada. I'm not in Prince Edward Island, but I don't live too far away. I'm on the East Coast-ish in Ontario. I grew up in Hawaii with a few years in California, and then I went to university in Texas and stayed there for decades until I came up here. I have been a teacher, fourth grade teacher, a reading teacher. I co-owned a children's bookstore, and I was a university lecturer of pre-service teachers. And I love to read, and I love to write. My 2 most favorite things to do.
Well, then you've chosen a wise career. You get to do lots of those things. I've got so many questions for you, but right away, Ontario, Canada, that's a big move. You've lived a little bit all over, I know, but what takes you to Ontario? And also, what's the process for anyone? I know that my wife and I have occasionally mentioned it when viewing the news that maybe it's time to look into immigrating to Canada. How much work is involved to getting there to Canada?
Well, I'm here because a few years ago, almost 2 years ago, I married my college sweetheart, and he lived in Canada. We met at the University of Texas and decided it wasn't a relationship that we wanted to continue, so we went our separate ways. Unfortunately, he lost his wife to cancer a few years ago, and he made a trip back to Texas, and a group of college friends got together and kind of went from there. So here I am. I came as a spousal sponsored immigrant. And the process took us from start to finish, maybe a year or so. There's a lot of paperwork involved, and it's quite complex, but probably for good reason. But I'm thrilled to be at this point in the process, and happy to be here.
Just what I'm hearing you say is my wife and I need to divorce immediately and find Canadians that we can marry, and then after a few years, maybe divorce them and remarry each other. Who knows?
I don't know.
Got so many questions about your background in reading and writing, because you've done just about a little bit of everything. So let's start just with the fact that you've got 4 different degrees, one of which was a Master of Fine Arts from Vermont.
Yes.
So what have each of those degrees and that level of higher education contributed to your writing, and specifically how did that MFA program benefit your writing?
Well, I love school. So I just kept going back and back for more degrees because I find learning, exciting and a thrill. So my first degree was in education, and then I did teach for 5 years. And when I got that degree, one of the classes I took was children's literature. And I was an avid reader as a child. And then high school, I dropped off reading a little bit. I was doing mostly schoolwork and related reading. But then in college, I fell in love with children's literature all over again. So that was, one of the highlights. And then I transferred that into the classroom where I read aloud to my students, every day. And reading was at the forefront of, everything that I taught. Then I decided, well, maybe I didn't want to teach forever. So what do I love most? Books. What degree could I get? Oh, how about a master's in library and information science? So I went through that program. And then as I was going through it, I thought, well, maybe I don't want to be in a school setting. Maybe I'll go the public library route. So that was my focus and intent until I got into school and realized, well, I need some money to help me pay tuition. And I got a job at an independent children's bookstore in town and absolutely loved it. And when I graduated, the 2 owners said, well, rather than get a library job, would you be interested in working in the store full time? And I don't know where I got the idea to come up with the answer, but I said, well, actually, I'd like to be a part of the store. And if we could make that happen, I'd be interested. And so we worked it out, and I was with the store for like 13 wonderful years.
So wait, they offered you a full-time position, and your response was, I want to be an owner?
Yes.
That's fantastic. You must be a savvy negotiator.
No, I don't. It just came out. I wasn't dreaming of that. I didn't have a secret, desire, but obviously I did. It just, as soon as they said that, I went, oh, well, how about?
If I ever have another contract to negotiate, or when I have another contract to negotiate, I'm going to call you and I'm going to say, Anne, how could this be 10 times better? And I know that you'll have a solution. That's excellent.
Well, people tell me that I look normal, but actually I'm a huge risk taker. Like moving up to Canada, doing things like getting involved in the bookstore. So I was single, and I thought, well, bookstores aren't extraordinarily profitable. And I wasn't sure that I could do that job for the rest of my life as much as I loved it. And so I thought, well, maybe if I go back to school and get another degree.
You didn't want to fall back on the two that you already had?
Right. No. So I pursued a literacy degree at the university with the aim of getting a PhD. And my focus was around literature, but not just solely children's literature. And when I graduated, I wasn't planning to teach, but I thought about like the world around us and the bookstore, I would say beginning of the end of independent bookstores in many respects, because big box stores and the internet was starting to to rise. And I thought, well, as much as I loved the store, maybe it's time to leave and to pursue, other avenues. So
were you kind of like the Meg Ryan character, and You've Got Mail, and that kind of a position?
Exactly. Only at the time I didn't have Tom Hanks.
No, he was in Canada.
That came later, years later, but it's okay. Yeah, exactly. So then, as it turned out, I was able to work as an adjunct at the university. And one of the benefits to that, aside from being in the university community, which I just loved, and teaching, which I love, I had more time to devote to writing, because, as you, I'm sure, are aware, small businesses require a lot of hours. And the store was my life in many respects. And teaching, while did consume many hours, I also had some more free time and extra where I could try and do my best to write.
When did it occur to you that all this being surrounded by books, all this love of reading, all this love of children's literature, that will lead me to become a children's book author? When was that a formal declaration of intent?
I always, I'd say from junior high on, I wanted to write. I'd never met an author. I didn't know you could be one. I know that sounds odd, but I just didn't. And I think it was in college when I took that children's literature class where I thought, oh, wait, this is a real person who wrote this book and told a great story or gave great information, and maybe someday I could do that. So I had the desire and the dream, but I've come to writing as a reader, not as a, English major, writer, journalist. And so I really didn't have a clue as to what to do.
So, well, here's a totally unfair question that I ask on a regular basis, an opportunity to alienate some of your professional colleagues. Look forward to it. What are some of those early books that you read and continue to read that inspired you and made you want to be a writer? Obviously, every book is our favorite book, yes. And it's a silly concept overall, because why would you pick one book when there are so many wonderful books you could be reading? But if you would, just offer us some of those early titles that you read that had a major influence on you.
Okay, so I would say an early title. Well, you mean my childhood or just
whenever in life that they spoke to you and said, "Okay, that's the kind of book I want to write. That's what the ideal looks like when I achieve it. It will be similar to this type of book."
Okay, so probably Judy Blume. Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, I just adored. And Super Fudge. And those were books, well, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, I read to my students and, saw their response. And I also loved My Side of the Mountain, Jean Craighead George. I'm not sure when this was later. Sarah Plain and Tall, I just think is a classic that I adore. So I could go on. Now I have, newer favorites. I add favorites every day, every week. I still love to read, and middle grade is my sweet spot.
That's when people ask me my favorite middle grade book, I just automatically say The Witches by Roald Dahl, even though I've read other books since that I've enjoyed, and that one's kind of problematic. But Dahl's dead. He's undeniably a great person. You can't argue with that. And all the different writers that I've had on the show and that I'm meeting, they can't get upset that I didn't mention their show, Roald Dahl's Beyond Reproach, or their book, rather. So what would you say of all that experience that you had? And I should also mention that an interview with Jean Craighead George is available at middlegradeninja.com.
Oh, yay, I didn't know.
So
Great.
head that way, esteemed audience. And an email came to me, I believe, written by the Judy Blume, saying, "Thanks so much for your kind words and your interest. I'm afraid I don't have time at this moment, but it's still a wonderful email. I've got it treasured and cherished." Yeah. So what would you say impacted your writing more? This is sort of a silly question because, of course, I'm sure it all did. But did you learn more teaching elementary school reading to children and hearing what they liked about stories? Mm-hmm. Or did you learn more actually as a bookseller trying to appeal to children readers?
That's a really great question. And I was definitely influenced by my students and what I chose for them and what I saw them reading. But I was in the classroom like 5 years, and I was in the bookstore for 13. So I'd have to say the bookstore had an even more impact because I was exposed to many more books, and I read even more. And our customers had, of course, a wide variety of interests. So I would learn from them as well. So I was exposed to and had, the best time reading.
You had a real monetary incentive to find out what types of books they liked and make sure you had them on the shelves, right?
Right.
Makes sense. And then, so at that point, are you keeping a routine for writing and seeking publication, or when does that begin?
No, there was no routine. There was a lot of hope and a lot of dreaming. And
both important.
Yes, definitely have to have that motivation. My first book was published in 1989, and I like to say it was, a stroke of luck. It was an alphabet book of Texas, and I got the idea from going back to visit my parents in Hawaii. There was a great book out called A is for Aloha, and I thought, okay, well, if this book is selling, certainly a book called T is for Texas, might sell. So I had a great time putting that together, was able to find a small press, and, it did well. So then at that time, though, I was back in school and working in the store full time, and I didn't have time for creative work. So that all got put on hold until I left the store about 5 years later. And then I thought, okay, it's January. I'm not at the store anymore. I'm going to write a story. So I wrote a picture book and I sent it to an editor. And then I waited. I waited for the call or for a letter. And, I went on with life. I got a job at the university. I, just had more free time. I enjoyed, not having regular hours. And in December of that year, I heard from the editor, and it was, "Oh, thank you so much, but no thanks." And I went, "Oh, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to write more." I mean, I just had no clue.
You let one editor say this book is dead, and now on to more writing?
Yes. And I probably worked on the story maybe a month or so. I mean, I was so clueless as to the process, as to, "Oh no, Anne, if you want to write, you should write more often." So I just have to laugh at myself. That next.
No, this is wonderful, because all the authors out there who are listening that are either doing something similar or have done something similar can be laughing. We're all laughing with you. Nobody's laughing at you.
No, it's just crazy. And then through the bookstore, I became acquainted with Kathi Appelt. And I was in Austin, and she lived like an hour and a half away in College Station. And she was offering a week-long children's writing workshop. I thought, oh, perfect. I'm going to take it. And that was my exposure to what a real writer could do. And it was a workshop that changed my life. And I'm forever indebted to her for that, for her feedback. I tried a new story and submitted it, and, have been writing on and off ever since.
So Kathi Appelt, former guest, go back, esteemed audience, check the archives. I don't remember what episode it was, but you can't miss it. In fact, I quote her now every time I do a class. I used to do a self-deprecating joke that why would you want to write, or you have to be a little bit of a megalomaniac to be a writer, because why should someone read your new book when there are already so many wonderful books in the world, which I thought was a nice self-deprecating joke. Have a little chuckle. Show humility. That was the plan. And she looked me dead in the eye on this very podcast and said, "Don't say that. There is a reader out there for every book, and that book will find the reader at just the right time." I said, "Well, my God, that's so much more inspirational than what I've been saying." So now I am in that, and I say Kathi Appelt's wisdom every chance I get. She's incredible. So that must have taught you just about everything you'd ever hope to know about writing, right?
Oh yeah, sure. No. Which is why I eventually made my way to Vermont College of Fine Arts, because while I did have another picture book published, I was trying to figure out how to write a novel, and I think I was making some progress. But I do best when I'm in school, when I have that routine and have assignments and someone mentoring me. So while I loved and still do appreciate all the critique groups I've been in over the years, it's not their job, my critique partner's job, to teach me everything there is to know or that they know about writing. So I took the initiative and went back to school.
So and this is a question I ask frequently because I know lots of listeners are contemplating possibly going back to school for an MFA, or they're young and want to be writers and they're thinking start with an MFA. But that's a huge investment of time. It's a huge investment of money. And so the question always remains, what's the trade-off? That MFA program, unfortunately, doesn't come with a guaranteed contract. Just complete it. Here's your book deal. So what did that time getting your MFA bring to your writing? How did you evolve, and how was that separate from the 2 degrees you already had? Was it 2 degrees at that point, or 3?
3.
Okay.
Yeah, and the MFA is my last degree. I'm not going to go back to school anymore.
I don't believe you, but it's
yeah, we'll see. But no, that it's been 10 years now, so I don't. Yeah, who knows though? Never say never, right?
If there was a habit to take back up, I could think of much worse than going back to school. That's a perpetual student.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No. So, I needed, I knew I needed the help, and I wish that I had been able to go back to school earlier, but life is life, and it wasn't possible. And now I'm convinced that for me, I went at the perfect, time after I'd had, a lot of trial and error. And I also was at a point where I could devote all my time to school, though it's a part. They ask you to commit 20 hours a week when you're going through in order to successfully complete the program. Many people, work part-time or even full-time and do the program at the same time. I had the luxury of going full-time and treating it as a full-time job, school experience. So for me, I was able to, just totally be immersed in the process. And I loved it because it was a 4-semester program, and each semester I had a different mentor. And approximately once a month, I would send my mentor my latest work, 20 maybe more pages and maybe an essay, dependent upon the semester. And I would get, just fantastic feedback on what was working and what I could improve on. So it was an accelerated process of 2 years for me. And I came out with, I think, a better writing vocabulary and understanding of the process. And, I had some manuscripts that I thought had potential. So
this is after you'd already published T.S. for Texas, right?
Yes.
They were just one time published at that point, or had you already published the second book?
I had I had a picture book biography, the story of Buddy Holly, published. But I couldn't crack the novels. And not that I'm an expert now, but I feel like I have a better sense of how to approach them.
So when did that, was it during the MFA program that clicked in and you said, okay, now I understand how this works and I can do it?
Now I understand more how it works, and I hope I can do it.
And I need to know, when was the moment you said, yes, I feel like a writer now. I'm a writer, because you're one of the most qualified people to be a writer I've ever talked to. So when did it kick in?
Well, I think it was definitely in school. It was a huge confidence booster. And my mentors were writers, authors, well published, and they were telling me that I was on the right track. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I will be able to get a novel published.
And that was how many novels ago?
2.
And I know there's another one coming early next year. No, it's June is the picture book, right?
Yes, May. Yes.
Since I brought it up, let's mention it. That picture book is called and is about?
It's called Rad, and it's about a fraidy cat who overcomes his fear with the help of his siblings. And it's the fear he has is of skateboarding. And I've never been on a skateboard.
Not even in preparation to write the book?
No. I confess.
How did you go about researching skateboarding in preparation?
Well, I have a really good friend whose son was a great skateboarder, and was growing up a great skateboarder. So I consulted her, and also did a lot of internet research. And then, I've lived around skateboarders. So, over the years, I've picked up, a little bit about the culture and about the way of skating.
Gotcha. And Rad will be available May 5th. Depending on when you're listening to this, it may be available already. Go get your copy. If your library doesn't have it, request a copy of Rad by Anne Bustard. And I'm watching our time, and I know that for your publicist agents, anybody that's listening, I know they're watching the time and thinking, well, they haven't really brought up Blue Skies yet. So I have more questions about learning to be a writer and about your writing habits. But for everybody listening, let's talk about Blue Skies, which is absolutely available now and worth reading. And the thing I try never to do is summarize another author's book when you're right here. I wouldn't make you sit through that when you could have a better picture book than I could. Plus, I'm bad with spoilers. So I've learned just be quiet when it comes to somebody else's book until I find out what you're comfortable sharing. So what do we need to know about Blue Skies?
Okay, so Blue Skies is a story about Glory B. Bennett. And she lost her father on D-Day on Omaha Beach. But she still believes that a miracle might happen and he could return to her and her town of Gladiola, Texas. So when the Mercy train boxcar, which I can explain a little bit, is scheduled to make an unexpected stop in her town, she knows that's the sign. This is the time when Daddy's going to come home.
So, yeah, tell us a little bit about the Mercy boxcar.
It was a grassroots effort, which I was unfamiliar with until about 20 years ago, started by a Frenchman, a French war veteran named André Picard, and he wanted to fill a boxcar of gifts from the French to send over to America to thank us for all we did before, after, and during World War II. But instead of one boxcar, the French citizens filled 49, and they shipped them over to the East Coast, and then railroads all across the states sent them on the rails to each one to the state's capital. And then they were put in museums, or a few gifts, I understand, were distributed. But I fell in love with that effort, and that was actually the spark for the story.
And it's a sad-ish premise because, Glory B's father's died. She's waiting for the body to come to, so they can have closure. And yet it's not an overly sad story, despite the premise. There are laughs throughout. You're going to have a good time, esteemed audience, I promise. So what tips do you have for writers who have a somewhat sad premise, which one might argue is as humanity's lot? When you have a bit of a sad premise, especially for middle grade readers, what tips do you have for not undercutting that, but keeping the tone and the story light, keeping the pace fast, and not bumming the audience out for 200 pages, but telling a story despite the sad premise?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the strengths of middle grade is that middle grade novels offer hope. And I think that's what needs to run throughout the story. And yes, there are sad events. There is sadness in the world, but there can also be light, and light can come from a sad time.
And who, aside from everyone listening, who is the ideal reader for Blue Skies?
Well, I think it's someone who is a dreamer, someone who does want or seek hope, someone who is passionate, someone who wants a heartwarming story, and someone who is interested in authenticity.
And I'm chuckling because I'm just remembering that the very first line of your book, if I may read part of your own book to you, miracles happen in Gladiola, Texas, population 3,421. And then she goes on to say, I want a miracle of my very own. So now that I'm hearing you talk about this is a story about hope. Well, there it is. My God, we've got a thesis statement right there at the start. You've set the tone. Here comes the hope. So I think that goes a long way right there to letting me know how you're going to keep this story heartwarming and engaging and not overly sad. Fantastic. Well, another question I had for you is I had read that originally this had started off as a picture book. Is that right?
It did.
Evolved into a middle grade book. And what was the process of expanding the story?
Okay, so when I first learned about the Mercy Train, I was it's also called sometimes the Gratitude Train or the Thank You Train. I was just, captivated by the story. And I thought, this could be a book. There could be a book in this story. And at the time, I was working on picture books. This, by the way, was almost 20 years ago. So I thought, okay, I'll write a story about the train. And I had two characters, a French girl and American girl. And I polished it with my critique group to the best of my ability. It was sent out to some editors. There were a number of no's, and there was one editor who said, I think there might be something here, but perhaps instead of a picture book, you could write it as a middle grade novel. And I went, oh, what a brilliant idea. I'll do that someday. I didn't have a clue, but that idea resonated with me. So I tucked it away, and one of my motivations for going to Vermont was to try and get a draft of that novel done when I was in the program. And I was able to accomplish that. And now I can't remember the rest of your question. Like, do you want me to follow up what happened next? I feel like I'm talking on.
Yeah, no. This is great. We're seeing absolute evolution. You've gone from one editor says no, and then we're done, to multiple editors say no, but we're going to continue to evolve. And by God, Blue Skies is going to be in the world. This is a story of hope. I like it. So yes, when from the MFA program, then what's the process of publishing?
Then what happened? Okay. All right. So, yes. So I completed what I now know is a solid draft in my MFA program. I, of course, thought it was finished and like, oh, let's send it out, and surely someone would want to publish it. But send it out, I did, to a few agents, and I got no's. So I put it away for basically 7 years, and I worked on something else, which turned into my first novel, Anywhere But Paradise. And then after that was published, I thought, okay, now what am I going to work on? And I puttered around with two other novel-like ideas, and was basically getting nowhere. I was pretty discouraged and thought, okay, well, it's great that I've had one novel published, but I'm not sure I'm going to have two. So I had a serious sit-down talk with myself and said, all right, well, if you could have one more book published, or even like written to my satisfaction, what would it be? And as soon as I asked that question, the answer was instant, and that was, oh, it's the Merci train story. That's the one that I have a really deep connection to. That's the one, more than any other manuscript that I have in the drawer, or that I'm even thinking about writing, I want to try. So the great thing about a manuscript that's been sitting in a drawer a really long time is when you take it out, you know pretty quickly whether it's a go or not. And I reread it and thought, oh, well, no, it's not ready to be sent out, but I can see that it needs some help, and I can see some things that I could actually do to, I think, make it better. So I was thrilled. And then I jumped in to revise, my critique group again helping, my agent helping, and then it found a fabulous home.
If it's not too personal a question, I never know what is. What types of things were you finding after 7 years that now more advanced, more seasoned author Anne Bustard comes back to earlier Anne's work and says, let me help you out. I see what you were going for. What types of things were you finding to help the book out and evolve it?
Well, I did find that I needed to expand more on some of the storylines. I found that in an opposite way, I needed to consolidate some characters. I had too many that were doing the same thing in the story. And then I just needed to, I'm not really sure how to even say this, take it up a notch in the writing. Make sure that every scene showed as many of the 5 sentences as possible, and that the writing was as tight as possible. So in my case, in that instance, I was pretty happy with the plot per se, but all of the connective tissue needed to be reevaluated. And I had to not be afraid to take things out, rearrange, and put things back together.
Gotcha. So what does your typical revision process look like? I'm assuming it's not 7 years for every novel.
I do a lot of journaling in order to discover more about my characters and what they want, what they desire. I find that while I create the novels on the computer, my brain does something different when I have a journal and a pen in front of me. So often that's when I make some really nice discoveries that I didn't know before. I have a book recommendation, and that is, I have it here so I wouldn't mangle the title. It's called Writing the Breakout Novel Workbook by Donald Maass. And he has literally hundreds of questions in that workbook to stimulate a writer's thinking about the story. And I found that to be an invaluable tool for me. So you could say I went back to school. Right?
Sure.
There's a theme here. I went back to school through that workbook to help me discover and uncover things that either I didn't know before or things that I need to revise.
So you're literally creating assignments for yourself for
Yes.
a class that you're both teaching and enrolled in. So
Yes.
Are you taking questions from Donald Maass's book and putting those in the journal and then just addressing them there?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. To see what happens.
That is outstanding advice.
Yeah.
I think that anybody that's listening that's got a novel that's not quite where it needs to be can follow that and hopefully flesh something out. Another question I wanted to ask you about is because you're taking this from originally a paperback and expanding out to a middle grade, it's a historical novel. Has to be a lot of research that went into this. So how much time were you spending researching things like the time period, the location, the Mercy train? I know PTSD had to come in at some point. You had to do research for that.
Well, I did do some research initially when I first discovered about the train. And then I just jumped into, the story. And then when I knew I wanted to try it as a novel, I went back and did a little more research. And then I did it on kind of an as-need basis until we had that 7-year gap. And yes, I had notes still, but I thought, you know what, I'm starting fresh. I want to research all over again. So I traced everything I'd done before. What I found at the University of Texas at Austin campus is the LBJ Library and Museum. And what I didn't realize when I first started writing this book or picture book is that in that library are the Drew Pearson papers. And Drew Pearson was a radio commentator and columnist who was the American link for the Mercy train. and he and President Johnson were friends, so he donated a significant number of his papers to the library. So at that library, I was able to read train schedules, telegrams, memos, newspaper articles, and more about the train. And it is a phenomenal resource, but that wasn't my only one. I went to other libraries, and I even went to the Austin Steam Train Association, which is now located in Cedar Park, which is a town just outside of Austin. And they have a refurbished Texas Eagle boxcar there, which the character Glory B spends about a minute on. But I went there so I could get the interior of the boxcar, just right. I love research.
Clearly.
It's so much fun. There's so many wonderful
Anne Bustard.
discoveries.
You're all about the glory of knowledge. This is fantastic. Well, here's the devil's advocate question, because I know the answer, but I still like to ask the question. And that is, when you're doing that, when you're getting the interior of the train exact, when you're looking through the train schedules, the only way that I, the reader, am going to know that train schedule is not correct is if I go and I check the train schedules. Miss Bustard, I've got you here. So is it that much of a concern to have done that, or is it just the fact that the time schedule wasn't correct?
Well, I tried to be as correct as I possibly could be with the train schedule, just because I'm all about details in life and in writing. So I did the best job that I could. I'm not saying I got everything right or that it's perfect, but I did the best job I could in order to find the details I needed to make the story as real as possible. There is no Gladiola, Texas, but I based it on the main street anyway, on a small town outside of Austin called Smithville. And in my mind, Gladiola is somewhere around Round Rock or Taylor, which is northeast of Austin. So I feel like I have to know these things, and for my own sanity and benefit, and hopefully that seeps in to the stories so that readers feel like, oh, this could have actually happened.
And so a couple more questions about Blue Sky, and then I suppose maybe we should think about calling it a show pretty soon here. But I wanted to make sure I ask you about the names in the book. I love that name, Glory Be, fantastic. And I had read that you'd gone through a few different names, and that names tend to cause you some trouble, and that you're frequently changing them throughout your draft. So what is your process for picking a character name, and when do you know that you've got a good one?
Yes, that's tricky for me. Sometimes it's instantaneous. Like, I know from the first draft what the character's name is, and all I can say is it just feels right. It comes to me. That's it. And then there are other times, like in Glory B's case, where the name changed, like with every kind of final draft. So when I'm struggling with a name, I again go to the pen and paper and just, make lists of names. Sometimes I'll look up years and popular names. Sometimes I'll think about people that have been in my past or in my current life, of names. Well, would they work? Are they like this character? I'm kind of all over the map with that. But I have to say, in terms of making a final decision, it's totally intuitive. It just has to feel right to me, which is probably not helpful at all.
Is there something that like goes off like spidey sense in your head?
Yeah. It's just like I know.
That's the name. That's the person.
That's the name. That's it.
And then I wanted to ask you, what was it about you? Because you said that of all the books you could write, if there was one that you had to bring into the world, Blue Skies is the one. Without getting into spoiler territory, what is it specifically about this book that made this the book you had to tell the world?
Okay. I have a really strong connection to World War II, and that's because of my father. When he was a young man in Honolulu on December 7th, 1941, some planes flew over his house. And he saw the destruction of Pearl Harbor firsthand. The next day, he joined the Army Air Force and flew a mission and others on D-Day. So while he didn't talk much about the war, his experience in the war growing up, because I grew up in Hawaii, we had lots of visitors come and family, and we'd always drive them around the island, and he was a great tour guide. So I heard story after story about what happened on December 7th. We would go to the Arizona Memorial Museum in Pearl Harbor, where many soldiers still lie under the water. And I was just moved by the stories, every single time. And like Glory B, I'm a daddy's girl. So this story, I feel particularly connected to. He died 15 years or so ago, and I miss him every day. What I didn't realize until I was on the last drafts was that this is really a love letter to him.
It's well received and out into the world to tell both part of his story and your story forever. It yes. Exists. You've done it. That must be tremendously gratifying to have reached this stage after 20 years of trying to get this story out into the world. So a natural follow-up I have to that, and I ask this as someone who is approaching the publication of probably not the last ever Banneker Bones story, but definitely the last for a good long while. And I'm constantly asking myself, okay, well, I have stories in various stages of completion, but that was the story I had to share with the world. So what's going to keep me going now that I've told that story? And what's going to keep you going? What comes next after it? Of course, I'm talking to you as you're launching publicity and all the things that you have to do yet with Blue Skies. But what's next for you? Yeah.
Well, I have an idea. I have some words down. And what I can say is that it's prompted by a real event that happened in Texas. That's all I can say.
Fair enough. You better not say any more. So there's so many Texas authors, though.
Yeah.
Kathi Appelt's probably listening. She might be looking for a great idea. Let's. No, Kathi would never do that, of course.
No.
Here's a kind of a lazy question that I try to structure the show as if I were going to be on a show. And I'm available. Get in touch, fellow podcasters. I'd be happy to come on the show. But if I were going to be on a show, what would I want someone to ask me about my book? And I would like to have just a blank question that I can fill in however I like. And that question is, what's a question you wish someone had asked you about this book, and how would you like to answer it?
I think I was hoping you were going to ask me that last question. I think that was it. About my connection, my personal connection to the story, because I wanted to say something that would honor my father.
Oh, excellent. We've
So
done
thank you. Yes.
Well, then my next question is, Anne Bustard, have you ever seen a flying saucer? And do you believe in them?
I have never seen one, and I so want to believe in them.
I'm going to send you links to Richard Dolan's history of was the National Security State and the History of Flying Saucer or UFOs. I can't remember the title. Look up Richard Dolan. We'll send you down a whole new rabbit hole with all the facts and information you could ever want to research. I'll talk to you next time you've got a new book out, and we'll go for rounds after rounds of flying saucer stories. Well, a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you about, and like I say, we'll call it. We're about at an hour. So is this a comfortable spot for us to think about calling?
I think so. Yeah.
You mentioned your book about Buddy Holly, and I wanted to make sure I ask you. And I know that what was the previous book that has a character named Peggy Sue? So I assume that maybe is a reference to Buddy Holly.
Yes.
What is your relationship to Buddy Holly, and why did you want to write a picture book about him?
Well, I was a Beatles fan growing up. They were my musicians. And then I had heard some of Buddy Holly's music, but I didn't realize that the Beatles actually chose their name because of the Crickets. So I happened to have a job that took me to Lubbock, like every month for a year. And I started nosing around up there after hours and visited all of the Buddy Holly related sites that I could find. And at that point, I was trying to write picture books. I was trying easy readers. I was just all over the map with my writing. And I thought, it might be kind of cool to try a picture book biography. Who might I write about? And it was like, I know Buddy Holly. I know a little bit about him. I'd like to know more. I love his music. And though he has a tragic end, he has a very hopeful story.
Here's a question to divide our audience. What's your favorite Buddy Holly song?
Well, I think it's got to be Peggy Sue.
I mean, you'd be crazy to pick anything else, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's so many things that I could ask you, and I won't. I'm going to restrain myself. But there was something you said that I think is maybe a good note for us to end on, I hope. Because and I'm going to get this exact because I'm going to quote you, because you've written elsewhere that in spite of my never, never, never give up stance, those dare I think I may quit moments came twice. Both times, my next efforts resulted in publication. So as much as you're comfortable, obviously, I'm talking to you now. I'm holding Blue Skies in my hand. Mm-hmm. Rad's going to be available to live on bookshelves forever. So we know how the story ends. It's a happy ending. Mm-hmm. But during those times where you were thinking of quitting, what brought you back?
I think what brought me back was I don't want to quit while I'm down. That if I tried, one more time and it didn't work, well, okay. I gave it, absolutely 100% and more. But to stop when I was discouraged just didn't, for me, ring true. I just had to try one more time.
And if there was, aside from that, if there was anything you could go back and tell yourself at the start of your writing journey that would maybe have made that journey easier for you and that authors listening to could maybe benefit from implementing, what would you go back and what advice would you give a younger version of yourself?
I would say breathe. That's really important.
It's essential.
And know that, it's a journey. I obviously, from what I said a while ago about, well, I wrote the story, I sent it to an editor, and then I just sat around and waited because I thought, oh, well, she's going to love it, she'll buy it, and then we'll go on from there. No, I mean, maybe that's happened to someone. That would be awesome if it had, or will.
Not to someone, I've been there.
Yeah, but no, it's not only is writing a book a journey and a process, but the writing life is that, as well. And there are going to be ups and downs and highs and lows and everything in between. And just keep going and I would say keep dreaming.
I think we're going to find a better place to end than that. Ed, this has been an absolute privilege and a pleasure. I so appreciate your making time today. Where can the esteemed audience find you online, find more information about your books and all that good stuff?
Great. Well, it's annebustard.com online or on Twitter at Anne Bustard. And I'm on Pinterest now. And I have some great resources for teachers for all of my books. So I would love people to drop by and visit me there too.
And as always, esteemed audience, check me out at middlegradeninja.com. Download your free copy of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees, all that good stuff. And make sure you're here next Saturday when my guest will be, I don't know, but you can find out at middlegradeninja.com. It'll be fantastic. And I always ask our guests to sign us off with a totally ninja-like justifies the name of the show sign-off phrase. And that sign-off phrase is hi-ya and what have you. Will you sign us off?
Hiya and what have you.